So for today's tutorial, I'm going to talk about a few theory questions first, followed by one numerical problem. Okay. So with the theory questions, we've got one from chapter 8 last week that we did not talk about. So we mentioned that we're going to talk about that in today's tutorial. Okay. And then we have four theory questions for chapter 9. So for these questions, I'm going to invite you to help me with the answers along the way. Okay. So question 1 in chapter 8, define transaction exposure and distinguish between transaction exposure and economic exposure. Okay. So with transaction exposure, this is the sensitivity of a company's of a particular transaction to exchange rate movements. Okay. So in a nutshell, how does the value of a particular transaction move when your exchange rate moves? Okay. So as the name suggests, with transaction exposure, our focus is on one single transaction. So for example, we talk about £1 million account receivable. So with this transaction exposure, with this type of exposure, it's very easy to hedge because you know exactly the size of the exposure and you know exactly your position, right? So you know how much your position will change when there is a 1 unit change in the exchange rate. So for example, for this particular example, now when the pound appreciates by $1 USD, I know that my account receivable will increase by $1 million USD. Okay, so that's what I mean by we know how exactly the position will change when the exchange rate changes. Okay. I think this should be £1 million. Sorry. So with economic exposure, it's a bit more complex because in this case, you're looking at the big picture. So you're asking the question of how foreign exchange rate movements can affect the value of your entire asset or liability portfolio. So the focus here is on the entire asset portfolio rather than one single transaction. Okay. So with economic exposure, it's not as straightforward as transaction exposure. So to measure economic exposure, you need to measure two things. The first is, of course, how much the exchange rate moves. And second, how much your asset value will move when exchange rate move as well. Okay. So in problem 3 today, we will illustrate how to measure economic exposure. Okay. All right. So chapter 9, question 1. How would you define economic exposure to exchange rate risk? So by definition, economic exposure is the possibility that the firm's cash flows or ultimately its market value might be affected by the unexpected changes in exchange rates. Okay. So in other words, you can think of economic exposure as the sensitivity of the firm value in the domestic currency, right? So this is what you worry about, yeah? So you worry about how after you convert your investment back in the domestic currency, how much is it affected by exchange rate movement, okay? So it's important to understand this concept because this is the idea behind the regression that we introduced in the lecture last week before the midterm, right? So the reason why we use this regression here, the reason why we want to calculate this beta here is because it is exactly the sensitivity of the firm's asset value to exchange rates, okay? So this is the idea behind this method that we introduced in the lecture last week, okay? So in problem 3, this is the model that we are looking at. Okay, so moving on to question 5, discuss the determinants of operating exposure. So before I discuss the determinants of operating exposure, I want to define the term first, okay? So what do we mean by operating exposure? So this is the extent to which the firm's operating cash flows are affected by exchange rates, okay? And it depends on the effect of random changes in exchange rates on the firm's competitive position, which is not readily measurable, okay? So with operating exposure, it's a bit more complex to measure because you don't observe the effect that exchange rate movements have on your firm's cash flows, okay? So for example, if I have a business when I export meat to Vietnam, so every time when the Australian dollar appreciates against the Vietnamese dong, then the products that I export will become more expensive, right? So besides the dollar price, I mean, besides the price I can charge on my meat, I need to worry also about the quantity I can sell as well, right? So these are the things that are not very easily observable. And so operating exposure is a bit hard to measure, okay? So luckily for us, for the purpose of this subject, we do not have to worry about computing operating exposure. We only have to worry about the concept, okay? So you need to understand the concept for the purpose of the subject, okay? So in terms of the determinants of a firm's operating exposure, or how would the firm react to a change in with an exchange rate movement? So there are two main factors. The first one is the structure of the markets in which the firm operate. So for example, I'm going to talk about an example later on in the next slide. And also the second factor is the firm's ability to change in response to the exchange rate change, okay? So for example, how much can you differentiate your product relative to your competitors, okay? So one example of how the product markets can affect the sensitivity of your asset value or your cash flows to exchange rate movements is this example here. When I look at Ford Mexicana, so this is a subsidiary of Ford, which is a car manufacturer in the US. So what happened here is we are looking at a company that imports cars from the US, right? So they take Ford cars in the US and they sell them in Mexico, okay? So here I've got a business model where my expenses are denominated in the USD because I produce cars in the US, right? And then I sell them to the Mexican consumers, okay? So here my income is in the peso, right? So in this case, now suppose when I have a change in the exchange rate where the USD appreciates against the peso, okay? So in this case, can you tell me what would happen to the firm's cash flows? All right. So I'm going to start a poll and I'm going to ask you for your opinion of what will happen to the firm when the USD appreciates, okay? Just a second. So here I've got the USD appreciates. So this is the question. Can you see the question on your screen? Now, so here I've got an appreciation of the USD against the peso. And what will happen to my company? Okay, so answer A, expenses increases. Answer B, revenue increases. Answer C, no change. Or answer D, both increase. I've got one answer here for answer A. What about the other three? I've got three answers. So here I'm going to agree with the two people that answer expenses increase, right? So that's the correct answer. That's because for this particular business model, my expenses are denominated in the USD, okay? So when the USD appreciates, it makes it more expensive for me to produce the cars, okay? With my revenue, because I sell the cars in Mexico and I get the peso, so when the USD appreciates, it does not change my peso revenue, okay? So the net result is therefore a decrease in my profit margin, right? So my expenses increase, but my revenue or my sales stay the same, okay? Now let's take into account the product market in our analysis, okay? So in this case, in scenario 1, what happens is that my competitors are mainly local car producers in Mexico, okay? So here I am, I've got a business model where I import cars from the US and I sell to Mexican consumers. My competitors, on the other hand, they source inputs from their local Mexican market and they sell to Mexican consumers, okay? So their expenses are in the pesos and their income is also in the peso. So in this case, do we think that our competitiveness will increase or decrease? Question 7. Right. So if I talk about the competitiveness of Ford Mexicana for this particular scenario, do you think that their competitiveness would increase or decrease, or there's no change to it? I've got a type in here. I've got one answer, two answer, three answers. Okay, so if you have answered A, can you explain to me why?
That's because the production cost increases for Ford to make cars for Mexico.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
how is it related to the competitiveness?
So the other companies might be producing cars at a cheaper rate than Ford and selling it at the same price in Mexico.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
So do you think it's good for Ford or is it bad for Ford?
Bad.
It's bad, right?
Yeah.
So the competitiveness of the company itself should decrease, yeah? So the company becomes less attractive to the customer. Yeah, I guess, yeah, so the market will become more competitive to the company.
Yeah.
But its competitive position will decrease. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. I understand.
Well done. So that's the right answer. Thank you, Rahil. So here, I agree with Rahil. So in this case, my profits will be more affected by the change in the USD because my expenses are in the USD, right? Whereas my competitors are not affected. And as a result, um, they are in a better position relative to me, okay? So therefore, my competitive position will be worse off. Okay, so let's suppose we look at the second scenario, right? So in this case, instead of competing with just the local producers, suppose that my main competitors are the US car producers, right? So suppose in scenario 2, I've got a product market where I compete with all the other US producers. Okay, so in this case, what do you think will happen to the firm's competitive position? I'm going to launch the same poll again. So this is for scenario 2. when all the other competitors are US car producers. Okay, so here my competitors are other US car producers. So I've got one answer and I'm waiting for the other three. Okay, so does anyone want to tell me why, what happened and why?
I can try if no one.
Yes, go for it.
That's because since all the US competitors are producing the car in America and the USD appreciates, it's the same for all, so there'll be no change in competition.
Exactly right, spot on. So thanks, Rahil, that's the right answer. So in this case, everyone is facing the same problem, yeah? So everyone's cost increase because of the higher exchange rate. So for me, I'm not worse off or I'm not better off than everyone else. And as a result, the whole industry stays the same, right? So the relative competitiveness stays the same. Now, in this case, in the second scenario, the firm is in a better position because now they can afford to increase their price, right? If the other companies also do the same. In other words, in this case, the whole industry will pass through the exchange rate change to their customers, okay? So in the second scenario, everyone's competitiveness will be the same. The only people that get worse off are the customers, okay? Because their prices, they have to pay a higher price. So this example illustrates to you how when you have a different product market, then your competitiveness will be different when the exchange rate changes, okay? So as a result, when exchange rate changes, it's not very clear what will happen to your cash flows. You need to look at the product market to tell, okay? Okay, questions 9 and 11. So question 9 is quite straightforward. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of maintaining multiple manufacturing sites as a hedging strategy against exchange rate exposure, right? So on the positive side, if I have many manufacturing sites, it gives me more flexibility to choose where to produce, right? So for example, Nissan has a lot of manufacturing facilities around the world. So they've got four in 4 countries, the US, UK, Mexico, and Japan. So when there is an exchange rate movement between the Mexico peso and the USD, say if the Mexican peso becomes less expensive relative to the USD, then in this case, Nissan can shift their production to Mexico because it's cheaper to produce here, and they can sell more to their US customers, okay? So they can produce where the currency is soft, and they can sell where the currency is strong, okay? So having more production sites give you this flexibility, but on the other hand, it is more expensive to implement, okay? So obviously, if you have to have 4 different facilities, it's going to cost you 4 times more. In addition to that, it's harder for you to take advantage of economy of scale, okay? So for example, if Nissan produces a total of 100,000 cars a year, if they only have one factory, that means they can use the same production line for 100,000 cars. So they achieve economy of scales in this case. But if they have 4 different factories around the world, that means they need to invest 4 times, right, in 4 different factories. And every factory would just be producing 25,000 cars, okay? So in this case, the scale of the production is a bit less for each factory. All right, so question 11, last question before we move on to the problems. Now, exchange rate uncertainty may not necessarily mean that the firms face exchange rate risk exposure. Explain why this may be the case. Okay, so even though you have a very fluctuating exchange rate, it does not necessarily mean that you are exposed to very high exchange rate exposure. Okay, exchange rate risk. So one possible scenario that could happen is that a firm they have a natural hedging position already. For example, they already have a lot of production sites around the world, so that every time the exchange rate change, they can shift their production accordingly. Second, they could have a very diversified markets, so they've got their consumers everywhere. So whenever a currency becomes soft, they can increase their sales somewhere else. Okay, so in this case, the firm is in a good position to minimize exchange rate risk. A second possible scenario is that a firm, is in the case that the purchasing power parity holds. So remember, with the purchasing power parity, this is the relationship between your exchange rates and your inflation. Okay. So we said before with when we discussed purchasing power parity, is that whenever there is a corresponding change in the nominal exchange rates corresponding to the differential inflation rates, then there will be no change in the firm's competitive position, right? So as long as the changes are just nominal, the competitive position of your company will not be affected. The only time when it is affected is when the exchange rate does not fully reflect the differential inflation rates. Okay, so in that case, there will be a real implication for the firm's competitive position. Okay, so in the long run, when we allow the PPP to be corrected, so when all the changes are nominal, then there will be no difference to the firm's operating cash flows because there's no change in competitive position, right? However, the problem here is that in the short run, so we're talking about even 3 years, right, in a 3-year horizon. In the short run, the PPP might not hold. And in this case, when there is a mismatch between the nominal exchange rate change and the inflation rates, then your competitive position will change, okay? So overall, under the two scenarios where number one, the firm has a natural hedge, or number two, the purchasing power parity holds. So under these scenarios, the firm do not have to worry too much about exchange rate exposure, okay? Because any changes will be nominal and there's no impact on their competitive position. Okay. Any questions at all before we move on to the calculation? So just one thing to note about the theory questions. If you read the instructions on LMS, you will find that there is a section in the exam for theory questions. And so for these questions, there will not be any definition or straightforward describe this and that kind of question. It will be more a discussion type or an analysis type of question, okay? So bear that in mind. So to do well in the theory section in the exam, you need to understand the concepts that we introduce. Do not simply just memorize them, okay? All right. So moving on to the problems. For this tutorial, we only have one problem, which is problem 3 in chapter 9. So in this problem, we are assuming we are a US citizen, right? So we are a US investor, and we invest in a company in Silicon Valley, okay, which is in the US. So as a British resident, you're concerned with the power value of your investment in the US. Assume that if the American economy does well, your equity stake would be worth $1 million US, and the corresponding exchange rate in that scenario would be $1.4 per pound. Okay. So in the second scenario, when the American economy does not do too well, your equity value would be 500,000 USD, and at that time the exchange rate is forecast to be $1.6 per pound. Okay, so there are two scenarios here, and you think that the probability of the boom scenario is 70%. And with the second scenario for a recession, you forecast that there will be a 30% possibility. Okay. So given the information here, the question asks us three things. First, estimate your exposure to exchange rate risk. Second, compute the variance of the par value of your American equity position that is attributable to exchange rate uncertainty. C, how would you hedge this position? And if you do, what is the variance of the hedge position? Okay. So question A, let's not talk about the question first. Let's summarize the information. So before we go on to the question, let's summarize the information in the question. So in this case, I'm a UK investor, okay? So my home currency, therefore, is the pounds, and my foreign currency is obviously the USD. So P star is the foreign currency value of the asset. So in this case, it should be in the USD, right? So this is my P star. Now, the exchange rate should be the direct quote from the investor's point of view. So in this case, it should be the value of the USD in the pounds, okay? So in this case, I'm valuing the foreign currency in the domestic currency. P is the value of my asset in the domestic currency. So in this case, it should be in the pounds, okay? So I've got two scenarios according to the question. This is the boom time, and this is the recession time, okay? So in the future, I think that there could be a 70% probability for a boom and a 30% probability for a recession, okay? When the economy is doing too well, my investment does quite well too, so that's 1 million. And in this case, I forecast the exchange rate to be $1.4 per pound, right? Now, the question gives us the dollar per pound exchange rate, but I need the pound per dollar exchange rate, okay? So I'm just gonna have to take the reciprocal of the exchange rate in the question. The last column is the pound value of my investment. So this is the domestic value of my investment, okay? So this is given by the foreign value, which is P star, times the exchange rate pound over dollar, okay? So if I do so, I will work out that in the boom time, the pound value of the asset is about 700,000 pounds. In the second scenario, these are the values that I got from the question. And once again, I'm going to take the reciprocal for the exchange rate because I want the pound over USD rate, okay? So if I do the same thing, I'll work out that the pound value for my investment is around 300,000 pounds. Okay. So if you have not already, then make sure you take a picture of this slide because we need this information to compute the exchange rate exposure. Okay, on the next slide. I've got about 20 minutes. All right, so moving on to question A. So question A is estimating your exposure to the exchange rate risk. Now, in this case, because we're dealing with an asset value, we're not talking about one single transaction. So the correct method would be to apply this regression to compute our exchange rate exposure. Okay. So this regression was taken from your lecture slide from the week before the midterm. So here I'm looking at a regression where on the left-hand side, I've got my asset value in the domestic country. On the right-hand side, I regress it against the exchange rates, okay? So here, one important thing to note is that this is the pound over USD exchange rates, okay? So this regression would tell me the sensitivity of the asset value to the exchange rate, right? And that is given by the beta coefficient here in my regression, okay? So the unit of the beta is the dollar, because if you times these two, you will find that you will get a pound value, okay? We haven't talked too much about A and E here. So A or alpha is your intercept. This is a constant, so it doesn't move with the exchange rate. So for the purpose of exchange rate exposure, we don't worry too much about the constant alpha. Epsilon or E is your error term. So every time when you run a regression, you're going to have some error terms, right? Because the regression does not fit the data points perfectly. So this error term is assumed to be random and normally distributed. So by definition also, it should not relate to the exchange rate, okay? So as a result, the only coefficient that we worry about in this regression is the beta, because it's related to the exchange rate, okay? So to compute beta, you need to follow this equation here. So beta is defined as the covariance between P and S divided by the variance of S, okay? To compute the covariance and the variance, you will need these three formulas. So obviously you need the formula for variance and covariance. And you need one more formula to compute the average value, okay? Which is this term here in your formula. So to compute the probability weighted average, you simply just have to take the probability of each scenario and you times with the value of the variable in that scenario, okay? So let's go through one example. So in this question, I'm interested in computing the average values for P and S, right? So let's start with S first. So I want to compute S bar, which is the average value of the exchange rate, given the two scenarios that we have from before, okay? So here it's going to be given by the probability for scenario 1 times the value of the exchange rate in that scenario, plus the probability of scenario 2 times the exchange rate in that scenario, okay? I only have two scenarios, so I'm going to stop here. So with scenario 1, this is when I have a boom time. So the probability is 0.7. And corresponding to that probability, my exchange rate is 0.7143, okay? So here my S1 is 0.7143. Scenario 2 is 0.3 probability, right? So 30% of the time we think that there will be a recession. And then the exchange rate at that time is 6.25. I mean 0.625, okay? So applying this formula, I will work out that the exchange rate in this case is 6875 pound per dollar, okay? So this is how I'm going to compute the average exchange rate. The next thing I'm interested in is I'm interested in computing the average value for P, which is the par value of my investment. Okay. So can you spend about a minute or 30 seconds even to compute the P bar for me? I'm just going to go take some water, and when we come back, we will talk about the answer. Okay. All right. So have we got an answer for P bar? This should be in the pals. Okay. So can someone tell me what is P bar? Right here.
Is it? So I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but is it 0.7 into 714,300?
No, it should be a pound number, so it should be in the thousands. So here I've got 0.7, is that right? And then I've got, let me go back to my previous slide. So my P1 would be this much, 714.
So I think I got 593,760.
Exactly, spot on. So that's the right number. That was the number that I was looking for. So that was 500. So 593.
760.
760. Spot on, Rahil. So this is the right number. Okay. So the next step would therefore be to apply these two formulas to work out the variance of S and the covariance between S and P. Okay. Which is what we need to compute the beta coefficient. Okay. So let's spend about 30 seconds to write the formula down for the variance of S and the covariance between P and S, and then I'll show you the answer. Okay. So I'm going to share with you the answer. Okay. So this is the answer for our question. Oopsie, I think it's too large now. So this is what we did before. We have calculated the S bar and the P bar, which is the average value for S and P. And then we're going to use that to compute the variance of S and the covariance of PS. Okay. So here I've got probability 1 times S1 minus S bar to the power of 2 plus probability 2 times S2 minus S bar to the power of 2. Okay. So that should give me the variance for S2. So here, this should be pound over dollar. And because this is the variance, the unit should be squared too. Okay. The second computation is the covariance between P and S. So applying the formula, I've got probability 1 times P1 minus P bar, and then times S1 minus S bar, plus probability 2.3 times P2 minus P bar times S2 minus S bar. Okay, so that should give me this number here. So to compute the beta coefficient, I'm going to take the covariance divided by the variance, and I'm going to get a number of 4.5 something million USD. Okay. So this is the beta in your equation. And what it tells me is that if the exchange rate moves by 1 unit, then my asset value would move by this much. Okay. Does that make sense? So the beta informs you, number one, how sensitive your asset value is to exchange rate movements. And number two, it tells you how much you should sell the dollar forward to hedge this position. Okay. So this is how much you need to sell forward to hedge your economic exposure. Okay. So if we have time, I'm going to illustrate how when you sell this much USD forward, you basically hedge this exchange rate risk exposure. Okay. So that is question A. Now, when you go through this question, this kind of question, you will find that this question is not hard at all. It's it takes a bit of time, but it's not hard because it's just applying the formula. Okay, so there's no trick in this question. You just have to apply the formula to get the right answer. Okay. Now, question B is a bit more tricky. So with question B, you need to read the textbook to get the answer. So here I just summarized information in the textbook for you. So with question B, compute the variance in the par value of your American equity position that is attributable to the exchange rate uncertainty. Okay. So here on the basis of the regression that we start before, P equals to alpha plus beta times S plus epsilon. So from this equation, we can deduce that the variance of P, the variance of the dollar value, sorry, the variance of the par value of this asset should be comprised of two components. The first one is a variance related to the exchange rate movements. So B squared times variance S. And where does it come from? It comes from here, okay? And second, the second component is the variance of the error term, okay? So it comes from here. Now, why do we ignore the constant term? So by definition, this is a constant, so it doesn't really change. So we don't have to worry too much about its variance, okay? So with this variance formula, we've got two components. The first one is an exchange rate related variance. And the second is a variance of the error terms. And this should be independent of exchange rates, okay? Because this is an error term, yeah? So by definition, it's random. And it should be independent of your explanatory variable S, okay? So as a result, if we want to compute just the variance of the asset value related to exchange rate, then it should be given by this term over here, right? So it should be this term here in our regression, in our formula, sorry. Okay. So the answer for question B is therefore B squared times var S. So we have computed B from a previous question, right? So we're just going to square it. And then we times it with the variance of S, which is what we computed before too. Okay. So the final answer is here. So this is the amount of variance in the asset value that is explained by exchange rate movements. Okay. Oops, this is the variance of P, so it should be the pounds. Question C, how would you hedge this position? And if you do, what would be the variance of the par value of the hedge position, right? So the first question is, if you want to hedge, what do you do? And second, if you hedge, what is the variance of the par value after you remove any influence of exchange rates, okay? So here is the variance of P after you remove anything related to exchange rate risk, okay? So we mentioned before with question A that when we computed the B coefficient, the size of the coefficient tells us the size of the short forward that we need to enter to hedge this position, okay? So how do I know that I'm going to enter into a short forward? That's because in my underlying asset, I have a long position, okay? So I have an asset in the foreign currency, that's a long position, yeah? So to hedge this position, I'm going to enter into a short forward, okay? So by selling 4.5 something million USD forward, I'm going to eliminate exchange rate risk exposure for this asset, okay? And if we have time, I'm going to illustrate to you how later on. So to compute the variance of the hedge position, so remember with the hedge position, we have eliminated exchange rate risk exposure. So the variance of the hedge position would therefore be the total variance of the position minus the variance that is explained by exchange rate risk, okay? So this number here will be the difference between the total variance, which is VAPI, minus the variance explainable by exchange rate movements, okay? I'm just going to write this. So this is the variance of the asset value attributable to exchange rate risk movement, okay? So to compute the total variance of the asset of P, I'm just going to use the variance formula that we saw before, right? So this is a probability weighted sum of square. So here I've got probability 1 for scenario 1 times P1, which is the value of the asset in scenario 1, minus P bar square plus PR2 times P2 minus P bar square, okay? So this will give me the total variance of my position. So to compute the variance of the hedge position, I'm going to take away the variance, the proportion of the variance attributable to exchange rate movements, okay? So from the previous calculation in question B, we know that the variance attributable to exchange rate risk is given by this term over here, okay? So B squared by S. Does that make sense to everyone here? It's quite important that we understand how to do this question, okay? So in the previous exercise, we have said that the variance of P, the total variance, is comprised of this term, which is related to exchange rate, and this term, which is not related to exchange rates, okay? So as a result, the variance attributable to exchange rate risk should be given by this number here, okay? So if we take that away from the total variance, we will get the variance of the position after hedging, okay? So after hedging away the exchange rate risk, our variance should be the difference between the total variance and the variance attributable to exchange rate risk, okay? So that should be very close to 0 in this case. Okay, so in the next slide, this is not part of the answer, but I'm just going to illustrate to you how when you hedge this position by selling $4.5 million forward, your exchange rate risk becomes quite small, okay? So in this example, we have computed that the beta coefficient is 4.5 something million, and we have said that to hedge this exposure, we are going to sell $4.5 million forward, right? Now, for this illustration, I'm going to assume that the forward rate is somewhere around the average, which is 0.6875. So here, I'm just going to copy the same table that we saw before, right? So these are the summary table. And I want to add one column in this table to illustrate the outcome of my hedging, okay? So with the hedge position, I'm going to have the same asset as before, which is P. So it's the same as the unhedged position. And then on top of that, I'm going to have a short forward position, okay? So as a result, the outcome of my hedge position is the sum of the two. So it's going to be the sum of the unhedged plus the short position. So for scenario 1, for example, this is my unhedged position, yeah? So it's just 7 something, 100,000, 100,000, sorry. And then I'm going to add the payoff function for the short forward, okay? So what I see here is this is how much dollar I'm going to sell forward. And this is F, which is the forward rate, minus the exchange rate prevailing at that time, okay? So F minus ST, which is the forward payoff function. So if you do this calculation, you will find that the hedge position in the first scenario is around 593,000 pounds. For the second scenario, I'm going to have exactly the same situation. I'm going to have the unhedged position here plus the forward contract. So in total, I work out that with the hedge position, my pound value would be around 594,000. Okay. So if you compare these two numbers, they are quite close. And if you think about how much fluctuating it is relative to the unhedged position, you can see that with the hedge position, it's not too different, right? It's not too fluctuating, okay? So this is to illustrate to you how when you hedge using the beta coefficient, you eliminate a lot of exchange rate exposure, right? Okay, so that is it for today's tutorial. As I mentioned before, the information for the final exam is already on LMS, and I would encourage you to read this document before the lecture tomorrow, okay? So with the lecture tomorrow, I'm happy to answer any questions about the exam, so you should take advantage of that, okay? Besides that, is there any last minute question or comment before I conclude the class? If not, thank you guys for joining in today, and I will conclude now. I'll see you tomorrow for the lecture. Okay. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.